Sawadee Welcome to this week's edition of Connections for Thai Move Talk. I'm your host, Brian Barletic. We continue hearing from the United States how China is bullying other nations in the region. We keep hearing this in regards to Taiwan, which we know isn't actually a nation. It is part of China, according to the US State Department itself and its recognition of the One China policy. We also hear how China is bullying nations in the South China Sea. This isn't true either. China and other nations do have disputes in the South China Sea, that's true, but these nations have disputes with each other as well. So when we hear about China bullying nations in the region, this is a lie. What is China actually doing for other nations in the region? China is building high-speed rail, for example. Laos just got their first high-speed passenger train delivered to them this month. China has been building infrastructure projects for nations in the region for many years, everything from dams and bridges to railways and providing rolling stock. Thailand, for example, is also building a high-speed rail line with China. China is also the largest trading partner for the nations in the region. The economic prosperity nations in the region enjoy are thanks primarily to China and its massive and still growing economy. This isn't just about trading goods either. Chinese tourists make up the largest number of tourists by nation traveling across ASEAN. Conversely, what is the US offering? Well, the US is a large export market too, that's true, but that's just about it. The US otherwise finds itself the actual bully. We see this manifest itself in all sorts of ways, from the US-backed mobs in the streets of Hong Kong in China, or here in Bangkok, Thailand. When the US doesn't like a particular government, it actively sets out to undermine and overthrow it, with a government it itself handpicks and is sure will better represent their interests, not those of the people actually living here in ASEAN. So with all of this in mind, here ASEAN finds itself being bullied again, and not by China, but by the US. And as usual, in this case, it is the US pressuring ASEAN members to in turn put pressure on Myanmar. This Reuters article, Singapore has financial leverage to pressure Myanmar, US official, is all about the US pressuring Singapore to sabotage a fellow ASEAN member. Why? The US claims it's to help restore democracy, but there was no democracy in Myanmar to begin with. The so-called elections in Myanmar, won by landslides by Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy party, were the product of immense US political interference, not any sort of democratic process. The US had created Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party decades ago, even hosted them in the United States outside of Washington, D.C. for many years. The US government, through the National Endowment for Democracy, has poured millions upon millions of dollars into Aung San Suu Kyi's political party and even invited her to Washington, D.C. to receive an award from the NED itself. To claim that this exercise of foreign interference is democracy rather than modern-day imperialism, and that this client regime created and installed into power by the US should be restored once again into power, and that ASEAN should help do this, is nothing short of the US demanding ASEAN to turn on one of its own members, assist a Western nation in subjugating Myanmar and its people to a political order answering to Washington, and thus making ASEAN that much weaker collectively. And if the US succeeds in convincing the world that China is a bully, and if the US is able to coerce ASEAN to turn on one of its own in regards to Myanmar, this will only make it that much easier in the future for the US to coerce, interfere in, and eventually seize the political systems of other ASEAN nations and beyond. While it is no easy task standing up to the US and evading the punishment it will impose on nations who refuse to be coerced, there are things ASEAN can do directly and indirectly to preserve their collective and individual freedom and sovereignty. This includes creating local social media platforms to serve as alternatives to US-based social media giants like Facebook and Twitter. This helps prevent the US from exercising unwarranted influence over the population of ASEAN. Promoting local independent media helping expose what the US is really doing versus what it claims it's doing through the Western media and its local collaborators is another very important step to take. Also, exposing and draining the funding of US-backed opposition groups operating across ASEAN will make it increasingly difficult for the US to interfere politically. Finally, explaining that what US democracy promotion is in reality, a violation of the UN Charter and blatant interference in the internal affairs of ASEAN members, will help wake the public up to what is really going on and attract their support for the much more difficult steps required to protect the region from the true bully lingering overhead, the United States government. That's it for this week's edition of Connections for Thai Move Talk. See you again next week. Sawadee Krap.